This is the final lecture in our interpersonal communication course this semester, and fittingly, it focuses on relationship dissolution and termination. So the information covered in this lecture comes from chapter 15 in your textbook. So as you know, we've talked about how research suggests that relationships pass through several phases or stages as people come together and get to know one another. And the same is true in terms of coming apart or de-escalating a relationship. But as you will see as we continue this discussion in this lecture, there are, of course, some variants on this. So let's go ahead and get started. Chelsea provided an excellent overview of Knapp and Vangelisi's staircase model a couple of weeks ago when she lectured on relationship development. As a reminder, make sure to think about what stage models assume in the relationship development and deterioration process. So for example, stage models help to explain a process that is unfolding. Developing relationships or deteriorating or dissolving relationships and how that happens over time. We've already talked about the relationship escalation process. So now let's review relationship de-escalation processes. So this is going to be a bit of a review from Chelsea's previous lecture. But the staircase model, as we know, has two sets of stairs, and the ones going up represent relationship development or escalation or coming together, and the ones going down represent the 5 stages of coming apart or the 5 stages of de-escalation or relationship deterioration. There is something in this model that we haven't yet talked about, and that is called the reversal hypothesis. And the reversal hypothesis argues that people undo their closeness as they reduce their communication with one another. And that's kind of how these relationships deteriorate and eventually dissolve over time. Now again, those top 4 stages, bonding, integrating, differentiating, and circumscribing, are where relationship maintenance occurs. So people in established relationships typically don't stay in just one stage. So it's not like once you reach bonding, you just are in that stage all the time. So you kind of cycle back and forth, and your communication exemplifies, intimacy and closeness in some cases, but then also distance and autonomy in other cases, right? So that's where relationship maintenance occurs. But our focus in this lecture will be on coming apart or relationship deterioration or de-escalation, or in other words, the 5 steps going down the staircase. So if you need to review this information elsewhere, you'll have to go back to chapter 5 for the staircase model. But we'll start with the differentiating stage. So in this stage, people begin to behave as individuals rather than as a couple. And they really start to emphasize their differences rather than their similarities. And those differences may become points of conflict or argument, right? So you might find out, for example, that your partner doesn't want to get married like ever. And you then begin to realize that this isn't the only difference that the two of you have. And in fact, maybe you start to notice that there are many incompatibilities in this relationship and with this other person. And also in this stage, rather than validating each other's positions and feelings, you start to question one another. And you might also, as an individual, you start to feel lonely, confused, maybe inadequate in some ways. And so you're kind of questioning one another, and you're kind of questioning yourself. And at this point, though, just because you're in the differentiating stage doesn't mean the relationship is going to totally fall apart. Sometimes people just need to assert their individuality, their independence, and their autonomy. And so they're not going to progress beyond this differentiating stage. Now, if differentiation extends, you may start to feel disconnected from one another, especially if you do decide that those differences that are now coming to light really outweigh the similarities between you and the other person. So differentiating you can think of as kind of the opposite of integrating. Instead of wanting to be seen as a unit, you now want to be seen as individuals. So this is sort of the beginning of the uncoupling process, which continues to bring to mind Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin's decision several years ago to engage in what they called conscious uncoupling. The second stage of de-escalation is the circumscribing stage. And so this is where the communication becomes more constricted, both in breadth and in depth. So it becomes more superficial, maybe even similar to small talk, except you are using talk or even a lack thereof to distance yourself from each other rather than to learn more about each other. Now your communication may become constricted at various points in your relationship, but when you begin to feel like you have nothing to talk about, it really could be a sign that the relationship is declining. And I am always concerned about this with my husband, which if you know him, you know I shouldn't be because he can talk just about anything. But it's a concern, especially when we inevitably devolve into talking about work. And so I continue to think, is this all we have in common anymore? But studying and teaching interpersonal communication certainly provides many opportunities for self-reflection, and there is plenty of things that we can talk about and do talk about. It's just when we're in the throes of a given semester, sometimes work dominates most of that conversation. So anyway, the circumscribing stage is characterized then by less self-disclosure, but also more negative disclosures. So you're talking about fewer topics, but your disclosure might increase in depth as you have more intense arguments and discussions about the relationship. So it's negative, but it's deep. If circumscribing does become persistent, the closeness that you once felt may seem like it's eroding, and you may feel frustrated, you may feel distant, and you may even start to feel misunderstood. And that could lead you to pursue different activities or to act sort of indifferent around one another. But again, some levels of circumscribing may be healthy in established relationships because you know a lot about each other, so you really don't have to disclose all the time to feel close. And circumscribing also helps you to communicate and maintain that need for privacy. The third stage of de-escalation is stagnating, and this is really when your relationship is at a standstill. Your communication is tense, it's awkward, and the relationship itself may become a taboo subject, right? Because you think, well, talking about the relationship is really futile. It's worthless. It's useless. I'm not going to get anywhere. You may feel like you already know, what the partner is going to say, which is mind reading. If you recall, we talked about mind reading in the conflict lecture, and mind reading is not good. So you might feel like you know what the partner is going to say, or that you just anticipate that the interaction is going to be negative. So you perceive and assume communication to be unproductive and unpleasant. You may begin to feel things like boredom, you may feel unwanted, but you may also feel things like sentimental. So your emotions here might be sort of contradictory, right? Because you might feel sentimental about the way the relationship used to be, but you might be bored in the current form of the relationship, right? So if you eventually sort of cease physical contact and you no longer are showing affection to one another, that is kind of your sign that you're heading into the next stage, which is avoiding. So the avoiding stage is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. In this stage, partners pursue physical separation if at all possible. So they may move into different physical environments, or you may just try not to encounter each other, or you stop spending less time together. So just a personal story, I actually moved from Kentucky to Connecticut with a boyfriend, which was probably not the smartest thing I've ever done. And then we ended up breaking up, right? But we had to sort of finish out our apartment lease because neither of us had anywhere to go. And I also actually kind of had a situation with a roommate who ended up being sort of creepy, and I couldn't get out of my lease without having to pay, thousands of dollars. So I had to get creative with my physical separation. So I would stay out later. I would find excuses to not come home, or I'd, sleep at other people's houses and things like that, just to try to maintain that physical separation and that physical distance. But, if you cannot separate physically, then you're going to separate psychologically and emotionally. So you might ignore each other. You might just do things to limit your contact and your overlap with that other person. You stay busy with separate activities. But the goal in the avoiding stage is really to achieve as much distance, whether that be psychological or physical, as possible. And then finally, the last stage of de-escalation is the terminating stage. So often in this stage, the individuals in the relationship will sort of discuss what went wrong and negotiate how their relationship is going to go, what it's going to look like after they break up. And you only really end your contact after you have that discussion and after figuring out what things are going to look like. So for example, people who are married and are getting divorced but have children, right? They may need to have a conversation about how we're going to navigate the co-parenting situation. Even couples who have pets, right? So if you're just dating or you're living with someone and you have a dog and you break up, right? What do you do? Who gets the dog? So there are some conversations that have to be had. In some situations, a couple may work together and they have to figure out how to navigate their professional lives at that point. So you have that conversation about, can we still be friends? Can we still talk to one another? And what does that look like? So this stage is also characterized by some really ambivalent emotions because you're sad, you're upset, but you might also be angry at the way things ended, angry at the other person, but you might also feel a sense of relief that things are moving forward, right? So there's kind of a lot going on in the terminating stage. It's more than just saying this relationship is over and I'm done. Okay, so again, that was supposed to really just be a review of the 5 stages of de-escalation of Knapp's model. Now we're going to move on to Duck's process model. So this is another process model of relationship de-escalation. And Duck, this is a person's last name, proposed that there are 5 communication processes likely to occur as people disengage from their relationships. And again, many couples go through some of these processes, namely the first 2, without ever breaking up, right? So that's actually where they sort of recognize and resolve relational problems and try and work things out. So the first stage of processes is called intrapsychic processes. So here is where you might reflect on the negative aspects of your relationship and compare those negative aspects to the costs of leaving the relationship. So in the intrapsychic process, everything is happening internally. These are primarily your thoughts. So you're thinking through the relationship. So it's probably triggered by relationship dissatisfaction. So you're kind of reflecting on what it is in the relationship that is making you unhappy. And then you kind of think about, well, what are the costs and benefits of staying in the relationship versus what are the costs and benefits of leaving the relationship. So you're thinking through these things, and maybe you're even preparing to talk to your partner, right? So initially in this process, what you might do is withdraw to sort of get your thoughts in order, to think about and reflect on the relationship and what you want to do. And then maybe in that thought process, you actually decide the problems aren't as bad as you originally thought they were. Or, on the other hand, constantly thinking about the problems in the relationship could actually promote rumination and make things worse. There is a really interesting framework called imagined interactions. So if you take the advanced course, you'll learn about imagined interactions. But these are anticipated interactions or reflecting on previous interactions that you've had with someone, where you kind of imagine the people in the interaction, how the conversation is going to go, or how you reflect on how the conversation went, right? So you're having this interaction in your head, and maybe in some cases you've already had the interaction, maybe in other cases you're anticipating a future interaction, but you're literally having like a conversation with the other person, but only really with yourself and in your own mind. Right, so this imagined interactions are actually really useful in that they can help us to identify problems, reflect on certain experiences, make decisions, and either choose to move on or choose maybe to end the relationship. So breakup here in this stage is really not necessarily inevitable, because you're often seeking to resolve problems and maintain the relationship. Now, when you begin to think that withdrawing is justified, you might be likely to then engage in dyadic processes that could lead to either relationship repair or relationship dissolution. So the second process involves dyadic processes. So this is where the dissatisfied partner communicates those thoughts and feelings to the other partner. So you might try here in this stage to negotiate and to reconcile your differences to avoid breaking up. Sometimes concerns that you voice are met with shock from the other partner, right? So maybe they don't realize that you're unhappy. And you may have to have a talk about the state of the relationship at that point. In this process, you are likely to discuss topics related to conflict, expectations for future behavior, and things like that. But you're probably still in the stage of weighing the costs and the benefits of the relationship. You might also renegotiate rules. You might make promises to change or improve behavior. Or again, you might just in this phase decide that the relationship is really not worth saving. So this stage is characterized by fights and arguments and really long, tense discussions. The third process here in this model involves social processes. So here is where you actually go outside of the relationship and you discuss your problems with your friends and your family members. So in other words, you're sort of trying to tell your side of the story here. Now, originally, you may do this to prevent the relationship from ending, but if the outcome seems inevitable, your social network can sort of help facilitate that breakup by providing support, or possibly taking your side, communicating that they understand your decision. And really taking your side helps then to convince you that you're making the right decision in this situation. So your network can sort of help prevent, or they can help facilitate the breakup. Now there is a huge important consideration here, and that is if you badmouth your partner too much and too loudly to your friends and your family members, so you put all your relationship problems on display, but then you decide not to break up, your social network, your friends and your family members are likely going to have a hard time accepting that person back, because it's likely that you've disclosed some pretty awful things about that person, right? So they're going to kind of wonder why you're deciding to stay with that person. And they're certainly going to view that other person in a different and probably more negative light. So you really have to be careful with social processes. Once you disclose negative aspects of your relationship to other people, it's hard to come back from that. The fourth process in this model is called the grave dressing process. So this involves the stories that you tell about your breakup. And this is sort of a way for you to feel a sense of closure to the relationship. And it's important to note that the stories you tell about your breakup are of course, from your point of view, but they are tailored in a way that lets other people know that you are a desirable partner, right? So you're going to discuss the breakup in a way that makes you look good or like a decent person. And so the specific story really depends on the audience at the moment. So you may tell the story in a different way to your family members compared to the way you talk about your breakup to your best friend compared to the way you talk about your breakup to your coworkers. Those are all certainly different stories, but provide opportunities for you to tell your story in a way that lets you kind of put it to bed, to put it to rest. So you are sort of burying the relationship. You're sort of eulogizing your relationship at this point, and that's why we call this the grave dressing process. And then the last stage is called the resurrection process. And so this is where you are actually kind of looking forward and visualizing what the future will look like without that particular relationship. So you kind of have this new image, this new idea of yourself as a single person, moving on, moving forward, and you actually begin to revise those stories that you previously told. Oftentimes you reframe the partner and the relationship in more positive terms. So saying things like, it didn't end well, but I really learned a lot from that relationship, and I value that relationship because it made me realize some things that I need to work on as a partner, right? So you're reframing everything in a slightly more positive manner. Again, with the idea of progressing, with moving forward, with moving on, with you've put things to rest, but now you're resurrecting it so that you can kind of revise the existing narrative. So this process is a little less linear compared to the staircase model, right? It's a little more free-flowing. The distinction between each of the processes is a little blurrier, it's a little fuzzier. So this kind of puts the focus on, the individual, the person doing the breakup, and what they're thinking, and then what they're communicating both inside the relationship but also outside the relationship. The staircase model really focuses on that communication within the relationship. So we've talked about Knapp's staircase model, and we've talked about Duck's process model, right? And so each of these frameworks helps to examine relationship deterioration over a period of time. So it's thought of more as a sort of gradual, sequential process. We're going step by step by step, and we can look at the communication events in each of these stages to help explain the undoing of a given relationship. But as we know, not all relationships end slowly and gradually over time. In many cases, relationships end very suddenly, or they experience what we call a sudden death. This is explained by catastrophe theory, which basically argues that breakups are often triggered by a critical incident that then leads to rapid disengagement from the relationship. In other words, we're talking about a turning point here. So we talked about turning points previously with relationship development. We talked about the turning points model. So a turning point is a critical incident that can actually lead to relationship termination rather than relationship development or relationship maintenance. So these are things like infidelity, big fights, violence, differences in values. So maybe one person wants to have children and one person doesn't. Maybe one person wants to move in together before marriage and the other one doesn't. Maybe there are religious differences that are creating some communication and acceptance issues and things like that. And so there's something that happens in the relationship that basically just triggers this rapid undoing and unraveling of the relationship. Now, there might be signs of termination early on, but either one or both partners overlook them or deny them, right? So hindsight is 20/20, in other words. So you may only see that there were signs after the relationship has ended. Now, it's important to note that critical incidents aren't the only reason relationships end abruptly. In some cases, relationships reach what we call a point of no return. And this is where one or both partners just kind of know the relationship is over. And so you end the relationship or you leave with really no warning or even signs of discomfort. So my question to you is, which model do you think best explains relationship deterioration and or termination? Do you kind of like the ideas proposed in the staircase model? Do you like the process model, or do you like catastrophe theory, and why? And then also, I would follow this question up with, which one of these do you think you see most often in the media? Whether that's how things are reported in terms of like celebrity couples, or just in fictional TV shows and movies, fictional narratives. What do you see the most often, and do you think that influences the way then you see how other relationships end, or what you expect from a relationship ending? Just something to think about. There's no obviously right or wrong answer here. Each of these has kind of advantages for helping to explain relationship deterioration, and each one has its limitations as well. All right, and finally, in terms of, how do we break up with people? There is some research that suggests that there are about 15 ways to break up with someone. 15 strategies, in other words, that people use when they are terminating a relationship. Most of these strategies are unilateral and indirect. So you have an option of your strategy could be unilateral or it could be bilateral. So unilateral would be one person decides to break up. Bilateral would be you've made a joint decision to terminate. Or they could be indirect or they could be direct. So direct, you're relying mainly on face-to-face verbal communication. Indirect would be sort of more subtle, more indirect communication, maybe even nonverbal communication. But most of the strategies here are unilateral and indirect. And when direct strategies are used, usually we're using the direct dump rather than something like a negotiated dialogue. You could use a single strategy in your breakup, or you might rely on a combination of strategies. I will say that indirect strategies are more common in casual relationships when couples have less to negotiate and discuss after the fact. And the idea here is that we're trying to minimize pain and anxiety, right? Breakups are stressful and they're one of the most face-threatening situations you experience. So you want to minimize guilt, you want to minimize embarrassment, things like that. Social media, for example, is quite handy for ending casual friendships. You can just unfriend or unfollow someone. And unless they're keeping tabs on you, they probably won't know for quite some time. Unfortunately, these strategies, the indirect strategies, are not very clear and they're really not very kind, right? So your partner may not realize the relationship is even over. So being indirect increases uncertainty and it may actually prolong the process, which makes it even more painful. So to look at some of these strategies more specifically, we'll start with unilateral and indirect. So avoidance would be, disengaging, withdrawing, defriending someone, This is the most common of all the unilateral and indirect strategies. So you just kind of withdraw and disengage from the relationship. Relational ruses are also indirect and unilateral. This really involves manipulation. So for example, what you might do here is leak an impending breakup to a friend or ask a third party to announce the breakup. Something to that effect, or you might pretend to be interested in someone else, or you might ask a friend to persuade your partner to break up with you first, right? So again, not very nice. It's actually quite manipulative and problematic, and it's really not fair to the other person. You could just simply withdraw your support or your affection from the other person, and that may be a way that obviously, not obviously, but might signal to them that you're no longer interested, and that may lead them to break up with you. Pseudo de-escalation is also deceptive, but it's not as manipulative as using relational ruses. So you might say something like, I want to take a break from this relationship. I need some time to work on myself, think about myself. And what you really mean is, this is over, but I'm trying to let you down easy. Right? But generally that's an ineffective strategy because you might provide the other person with false hope. So again, these strategies are not, your goal might be to lessen the hurt feelings, but you might actually, in the end, be increasing hurt feelings and the possibility of even maintaining any kind of friendship after the relationship is over. Cost escalation is also very manipulative. So basically you're trying to make the relationship unattractive to the other person in hopes that they break up with you. Some unilateral and direct strategies involve the direct dump. So this is the most common, probably the most effective, right? So it's open and it's honest, and you basically say, I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. We are done. You could date other people, right? And you might say something like, well, I told you I was going to date other people, so here I am, that's what I'm doing. You might provide justification or provide a reason for the breakup to your partner. You might try to explain why the relationship is ending or why you're dissatisfied. You might use the relationship talk trick. So something like, we should just both go our separate ways. So you're basically, what you're doing here is you're trying to structure the communication so that the conclusion at the end of that conversation is that problems are insurmountable. And so we really just, there's nothing else that we can do as partners to save the relationship. Threats and bullying are also direct tactics. Again, not very safe and incredibly problematic. You might try to directly dump somebody using a positive tone. So trying to make the other person feel better about the breakup, trying to lessen their hurt feelings. So you say things like, I have no regrets about our time together. It just wasn't meant to be. You might say something like, staying in the relationship really wouldn't be fair to you. You're a great person and you deserve someone better. And really at the end of the day, it's a bunch of BS. And I'm not saying that you don't mean those things, but you're breaking up with that person because you want to, not because you really feel bad about their situation. And then you might also use a de-escalation tactic. So you kind of scale back the relationship. Maybe you propose a trial separation. Maybe you walk back to like trying to be friends first. So kind of like starting over. That's another option you have for direct and unilateral strategies. In terms of bilateral and indirect strategies, fading away is something that happens. So this is when both people kind of feel the relationship is at a standstill and you just kind of gradually lose touch. So this is the opposite of catastrophe theory, right? So it's nothing that's triggering sudden death, but things just kind of stagnate. And then over time, you just kind of gradually, slowly unravel. Bilateral and direct strategies involve the blame game. So this is when your dissatisfaction in the relationship leads to a competitive blame game that results in the breakup, right? So you have a lot of cycles of negativity. You might agree to break up and then argue over the reasons for the breakup and blame each other for the relationship's end. So basically you're just pointing fingers at the other person, telling them it's your fault. No, it's your fault. You know, we could work through this if you weren't such a nag. Well, you know, I'm only a nag because you don't listen to anything I say, back and forth, right? So it's a lot of negativity, and that eventually ends to termination. And then you have the negotiated farewell as a bilateral and direct option as well. So this is where you are kind of trying to be fair to one another, and you're trying to leave the relationship on a high note rather than on a low note or a sad note. So you talk through the relationship, talk about, you know, the things that were really great, but also the things that were problematic and what eventually led to the breakup. This strategy is used when there are high levels of intimacy and commitment, and also when your social networks overlap, right? So you're trying to basically save face for everybody involved. You're trying to protect everybody's identity and image and feelings. So of all of these, the negotiated farewell is probably the most fair. It's the most open, the most effective, the least likely to leave people hurt at the end of the day. But, you know, the direct dump is also kind of, it's unquestioning. So if you directly dump somebody, at least there's no question about your feelings about that person or the relationship. So reflecting on your different types of relationships, do you think there is a more appropriate strategy depending on whether the relationship is casual or whether it is serious? So which strategies have you used when ending your casual relationships? Have you relied primarily on the indirect and the unilateral, which is what the research suggests we do? Have you been more direct and unilateral? Or is it more of a kind of two-person decision that's either direct or indirect? So what do you think in terms of strategies you've used previously? And then secondly, compare that to your serious relationships. Which strategies are you more likely to use when you're ending a more serious, long-term committed relationship? Do your strategies differ depending on who the person is, what the situation is, how long the relationship was, and things like that? So just something to think about and reflect on as we end this semester and end our academic relationship with one another. I'm not directly dumping you. It is just time for our relationship to come to an end, unless, of course, you take the advanced interpersonal course or another course with me in the future.